Welcome to Kibbe on Liberty. Hi, guys.
Hi.
Hey.
How's it going?
Good.
I'm excited about this conversation because I'm meeting you for the first time. I've talked about your work in the past with Chris, Chris. And I'm curious, like we were just talking about this, but you were a professor at George Mason.
That's right.
And you wrote your dissertation at George Mason under Professor Coyne.
Correct.
Does he still make you call him professor?
No.
Yeah.
Although, to be fair, I don't think you ever made me call you professor.
Yeah, that's right.
So you're not that kind of professor?
No, not at all. No titles, fanciness, and none of that.
Yeah. Was it, when did you guys take on this franchise of sort of applying public choice theory to the military-industrial complex? Was it during grad school?
So he had been working on these issues already. And specifically when we started working together was he had an idea and approached me with this, hey, would you be interested in writing something on policing and police militarization? And as a graduate student, I recognized a good opportunity when I heard one.
Yeah.
It's your first year, right?
Your
first year?
Yeah, I think it was the end of my first year. And so we started working on that project. And I guess I must have done okay because he was then willing to work with me on subsequent projects. And then it's been, I guess, a decade and some change and still working on it. So
Did he ever warn you that you would make it virtually impossible to get a job in any think tank in Washington, D.C., with a few exceptions, but not that many?
I don't know that we had that explicit conversation, but I had a feeling I knew what I was getting into. And one of the things about working on this topic specifically is that you have to have a thick skin, and then also be willing to really, for lack of a better phrase, stick to your guns about what exactly it is that you're talking about.
I mean, I love military metaphors. They're
Yeah,
the best.
sure.
So you're declaring war literally on the military-industrial complex.
You can go with that.
At war with war.
Right.
At war with war. So we're here to flack the new book, which when this runs, it will have come out yesterday. So we're going to pretend that it's whatever that time-space continuum is. And this is my favorite. You guys have written 2 other books together, is that right?
Three prior to this.
3.
Fourth.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And I like this for several reasons. One, I should read it. How to Run Wars, a confidential playbook for the national security elite. And the reason I like it is that it's short and concise.
Yep.
And it is satire. And the hallmark of satire in my mind is how closely it reflects reality. And you could read this and think that you guys were serious, that you actually were advising the military elite on how to better conduct never-ending wars. Tell me about the inspiration for this particular project.
Yeah. Well, satire, as you noted, it's a very creative writing style when done right. So if you think of people historically from Mark Twain, Jonathan Swift, Frederick Bastiat, of course, they were very effective in using this style to hold up a mirror, if you will, to the populace, to the reader, and get them to realize the tensions and absurdities of various widely accepted practices, policies, and so on. And so the inspiration behind this is an economist by the name of Bruce Winton Knight, who is Frank Knight's brother, the famous Chicago economist. And I was giving a talk somewhere, and someone came up to me after and said, you sound like Bruce Winton Knight, who I never heard of. So it turns out in the 30s, he wrote a book on war, and it was a satire. And it was basically mocking war, but in a way that he was pretending he was serious about it.
Yeah.
So I read this. I had to track down this book that was long out of print, and I called up Abby and I'm like, "You got to read this book. It's amazing." So she read it. We're like, "We got to work on this. This is the next project." And it is the fastest book we've ever written, not just because of the short length, but it is a blast to write in this style. Mm-hmm. Another war metaphor for you.
Yeah.
It gets you in a completely different mindset than we're used to writing as academics. And so everything's, by the way, documented and footnoted. So the satire is not fictional. Right. Everything we talk about in the book is actually stuff that happens in the war-making state. But we try to point out the absurdities along the way, but in a very serious tone.
So there's two incidents that I was thinking of that have happened in the last, well, one happened last week and the other happened a little bit before that. I'll go back to, there's a Washington Post columnist named Mark Thiessen who wrote what I thought was just the most repugnant piece ever defending further funding of Ukraine, because he's like, this is creating American jobs, and shame on Republicans that are questioning Ukrainian funding, because look at all the bombs we make in Ohio. Look at all the tanks we make in Ohio. And he thought that this was sort of a moral, politically savvy argument. I'm like, do you even understand what you're saying? You're creating jobs by exporting murder.
Death and destruction, yeah. Yep.
So, but like, he wasn't being satirical.
No. Which is nice. The book kind of writes itself in a way.
Yeah. And then fast forward to Lindsey Graham sort of said the quiet part out loud the other day when he was arguing that the reason we have to do this war in Ukraine is to make sure that those mineral rights don't go to the evil Russians. We want those. So we're killing people for minerals now? Is that what we're doing? I don't know, but it reminded me of this because the way that the elites behind closed doors talk about this is very much, you point this out, the quote, I've always attributed to Stalin, but apparently it's one of Stalin's guys, that you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's a very collectivist mindset that you could lose many millions of people for the greater good.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we want people to take away from this book is, as you mentioned, it's the saying the quiet part out loud.
Yeah.
We would like for it to be incredibly loud.
Yeah.
But when you get down to it, when you're talking about a variety of different types of foreign policy interventions, a lot of people don't understand what's necessarily required. So in terms of like people writing an op-ed, they see the potential for job creation, but then don't understand all of the potential effects, or maybe haven't thought about the potential effects, both foreign and domestic, that comes as a result. There's this real tendency to look at the potential upside, and I have a really big asterisk on potential upside, but almost a complete neglect of all of these different types of cost, and really a failure to appreciate the institutional structure in which these types of policies are carried out.
Yeah, another example of that, Thomas Massey was recently talking about a briefing he got from the top security elites behind closed doors, and they couldn't or wouldn't tell him. They were very eager to tell him how many Russians had been killed in this current conflict, but they couldn't or wouldn't tell him just how many Ukrainian men had been wiped out in this, because they want to control the narrative, which of course is the, I think it's the anchor of the story that you tell. Like, how do we control the narrative so that people who would otherwise say, hey, wait, this doesn't sound like a good deal. And they've always done that.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah, and of course, there's, in addition to the cold, hard kind of economic aspects, the military Keynesianism, one aspect of that is, does this actually create jobs? But the other aspect is a moral, ethical one about the very nature of the enterprise itself, which I think you were getting at with your initial point about raising this op-ed, which is war making, the military industrial complex, on the one hand, is another government program. It's a government program writ large, but it is unique. It's certainly different than schooling, for instance. The difference to my way of thinking being that it involves investing scarce resources in the tools to control people, repress people, and kill them. And so talking about it like it's a job-making program, there's something very off about that in terms of the kind of moral rot that's involved in thinking that is a sound argument to make, and one that in any way, shape, or form comports with liberal values, even in the most elastic sense of how you could interpret those values.
Regular viewers of Kibbe on Liberty already know how obsessed I have been with the pandemic industrial complex and all of the stupid, authoritarian, and downright evil things that the government did to us during COVID-19. Well, I'm proud to announce a new investigative series that looks to get to the bottom of all of that. It's called The Cover-Up, and I'm producing it in cooperation with BlazeTV.
The only place you're going to see this is BlazeTV. So go to FauciCoverUp.com/Kibbe and use the code FauciLied for $30 off your annual subscription. Do it now. The truth is out there.
The question that, and we've talked about this before, but the question of controlling the narrative, and we've talked in the past about how, they buy the football stadiums and they buy the sports arenas, and they've taught people this sort of inch deep sort of patriotism kind of thing, but it's getting harder for the war machine to control the narrative. And this is where I was talking about this before. Like, I'm obsessed with the pandemic industrial complex, and I'm doing this new series called The Cover-Up, which is about Fauci, but it's also about, I want to discover who Fauci's boss is. And if you start looking at the Venn diagram of the pandemic industrial complex and the military industrial complex, it turns out that it's wildly overlapping. And you can see this in the context of all of the alphabet agencies that were involved in the Twitter files and the expose on controlling the narrative. They used to just buy the reporters, and now they can't control the public so well. So what are the new techniques? Like, you're advising me as a military elite, how do I shut these people up? They're talking about this stuff.
Well, it's a challenge. And in the book, we do spend some time talking about, so you mentioned the Twitter file specifically. So we spend some time talking about control of social media. And there's some very clear, maybe not as clear as it might be in the future when we have more information or documentation, but there's some very clear connections between major social media players and various government entities in terms of how do you stop misinformation, or how do you change or otherwise narrow or focus the narrative in a way that comports with what it is that officials are trying to convey. But really, a lot of this, mentioned it's different. Some of it is different. So obviously, World War II, you don't have Twitter. But a lot of the tools that are being used are really similar to ones that were used in the past. They might just look a little bit different. So it's old wine in new bottles. But you mentioned sports as a franchise. Still a remarkably popular method. The relationship between the Department of Defense and television and film studios is something else that we discuss in detail. And so it's not, I think, one specific element. It's a multi-pronged type of approach. But I anticipate that we'll get some additional information about those entanglements between social media in the coming years. But right now it's just really fresh. And so as a result, hard to suss out specifically.
You ruined the latest Top Gun for me, because I had just talked to you, and I had to watch it as a piece of military propaganda instead of what they want you to watch it as, which is America F yeah.
That's right.
Kind of thing. And I'm like, this entire thing is financed by the military industrial complex. But the other piece is the question of the granular level that these alphabet agencies, and I think it's actually housed in Homeland Security, are determining what is acceptable speech now. And that ultimately is a military operation. It's not about safety or acceptable speech or policing hate speech or however they frame it. It's building the apparatus to control the narrative in a very decentralized world.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things that we talk about, and the reason that when we start this and we write this book as a playbook that is written for the national security elite, but of course is meant for broader public consumption. But there's a reason that we start off with the narrative. And it's because the narrative is what's required. It's the bedrock that underlies the rest of it, because in order for a foreign policy to be successful or to be able to carry out any type of foreign policy, you have to have the support of, or at a minimum, the acquiescence of, the broader populace. And so I think this really kind of highlights what it is that we've just been talking about with, you have all of these different agencies or all of these different ways that government is working to craft and really sell that narrative to the public. And you're highlighting some of, I think, the tricky parts for government in a contemporary sense, like what do you do with social media? What do you do with YouTube? What do you do with Twitter? What do you do with Facebook? And I said it's different in some ways, but it's really just a continuation of stuff we've been seeing for a really long time.
they used to just own and control the guy at the New York Times.
Yeah,
and they would
Right.
feed him the narrative, but they can't stop. Like in the context of COVID, there was this grassroots movement called Drastic, and I forget what the acronym stands for, but it was a bunch of very savvy citizens that knew how to dig deep into the internet and expose all of the government secrets that the government thought it had buried. Well, it turns out the internet's forever. And you can't stop all those guys, and you can't buy them all off. So it's like a whole new ballgame.
Yep. I mean, this point about the militarization that you mentioned earlier, I think is a very important one. We were talking before we started about Don Lavoie, your former professor at George Mason. And he wrote a book called National Economic Planning, What Is Left. In 1985, it was published. And of course, he was talking about what he called non-comprehensive planning. So industrial policy, not trying to plan the whole economy, but segments of it. So the means of central planning, but not covering all aspects of the economy. And he made a really important point in that book, which I think is neglected, which is when you invoke economic planning, it doesn't have to be for the whole economy, but it can be a sector. It requires the militarization of the economy. And that doesn't mean tanks and AK-47 sticking in your face, although it can. It means hierarchy, regimentation, control of information, the domination of the many by the few. And that point doesn't just apply to economic planning. It applies to public policy. This is what you're pointing out, as I understand it, related to the pandemic, to information control in general, to war making. It is militarization of various aspects of life, because once you centralize control, that is what is required in order for that apparatus to perform its tasks and achieve its goals. And people forget that. They forget the kind of industrial organization of what the state requires to do these things.
And also, like there's a knowledge problem here. It's like war is a form of central planning, and you're assuming that a fairly small handful of people could possibly conceive of how to create democracy in Afghanistan.
Yep.
Such an arrogant goal, and of course, it didn't work. I don't. Hopefully, people notice that it didn't work out that well.
I'm not so sure, but
yeah.
Interestingly, as a side note, but an important one, again, as we think about policy with government in general, many of the early arguments for socialism by the socialists themselves, I'm talking early 1900s, were based on war.
Yeah.
So they said, look how great war making is for economic productivity. We create jobs. We get all this output. So what we need to do is simply pick that up and apply it to shoes and clothes and housing and so on during peacetime. And that what's oftentimes lost today is the point you just raised, that war making itself is centralized planning. And so then let's think through what the implications of that are. And if you don't appreciate it, it's very easy to, because it's such a part of our life, to just ignore and treat it like it's like anything else.
Yeah.
But it's quite pervasive in terms of the tyranny and the ripple effects throughout life when you think about it.
The ripple effects, the unintended consequences, the blowback, as those of us critical of this stuff talk about, that's part of their model, because you can't have never-ending war unless you start the next one.
That's right.
And like the entire ecosystem, the infrastructure, and the financial interests behind it depend on the next thing. It doesn't stop. Do they know that? Or is it just it's just unintended chaos that where they're constantly chasing a new war to fight?
I think there are a couple of ways that you could potentially look at that. And one interpretation would be that you have people who are intentionally thinking about, what's the next conflict, what's in the interest of growing this particular sector. But one of the things that I think is really important to highlight is that none of the things that we are talking about in this book or elsewhere require malevolence on the part of public actors. And so in a really kind of broad sense, the point that we're making is an institutional one. It's not an argument that you have a few bad apples, or if only we had different people running the Pentagon or in the White House or in Congress, you would get a different outcome. It's not the players who we're necessarily taking aim at as individuals. It's the game that they're playing.
Yeah. And
so when you find that people are operating within this institutional structure, this is what then follows from operating within that institutional structure.
And then if you do get bad people,
right,
then you're really in trouble. Because even under the first best scenario, you're going to struggle. And that might be too charitable way of putting it.
Yeah.
So then when you do get selection effects and you end up with less than desirable people in charge of these levers of power, that's a real concern.
And I think you do have reason to be concerned about that. I mean, F.A. Hayek talks about that in The Road to Serfdom. It's chapter 10, why the worst get on top. And so then you think about, again, what Chris was saying, first best versus nth best. And so then if you take Hayek and you take other folks who make similar arguments seriously, then you combine those two things and you're like, oh man, we might really be in trouble.
I want to tell you about this new brand that we love here at Free the People. Our friend Jennifer Say, free speech warrior and truth teller, has started her own athletic clothing brand. It's called XXXY Athletics, and it is the only athletic brand standing up for women's sports. We met Jen when she spoke out against the insanity of COVID lockdowns and school closures, and stood up for our freedoms. She risked her reputation to do the right thing, and she's doing it again now. A lot of other brands out there claim to champion women, but only Jen actually does it with her new brand, XXXY Athletics. As a former elite gymnast, she was the 1986 national champion. She knows the importance of protecting Title IX. And as the former Levi's brand president, she knows a thing or two about great products. XXXY Athletics just launched their performance wear for both men and women, including cool t-shirts, bike shorts, and leggings. So check it out at xx-xyathletics.com or thetruthfits.com. Don't give your money to athletic brands who don't share your values. Give it to a brand that speaks truth, stands up for free speech, and puts quality first. Use the code Kibbe75 and you'll get free shipping with orders of $75 or more. Finally, an athletic brand with a cause you can get behind. Go show XXXY Athletics some love. Wear the truth out loud. Go to xx-xyathletics.com and use the code Kibbe75. That's KIBBE75 to order. Do it now.
I think it was Anne Applebaum who argued in her book about Stalin that he's treated as this anomaly, as this monster that screwed up this otherwise beautiful model of socialist utopia. And she basically argues, no, he was a rational actor responding to incentives. And one of the incentives was to kill a lot of people to maintain power. So I do think, like, you can imagine, and my conservative friends have this blind spot, I think, because they want the police to do their job and they want the military to keep us safe, but they don't appreciate their critique of other government programs applies tenfold to these, because you're giving people so much power, the power to kill.
Yep, certainly.
So I want to go back to a point you were making, because it seems different today. If I turn on CNN, if I turn on Fox News, I don't do it this often, but I watch clips on YouTube because I don't want my brain to get damaged. But there's so many former CIA, FBI generals. Tell me about the relationship between corporate media and the military-industrial complex, because it looks almost like the same thing anymore.
Yes, I mean, there are a few different things that we could talk about. So when we talk about the narrative and the narrative crafting being important, who is conveying that narrative is also important. And so we provide a variety of different historical examples, both in, say, relatively recent history and then more recent history, to talk about exactly how those relationships have worked. And so that might look like providing unbiased experts to provide commentary for major news networks who, to your everyday watcher, are going to appear like some objective analyst who's been pulled in from a think tank or from wherever, who actually has been offered talking points by, say, like the Bush White House to sell the war in Iraq. We spent some time talking about the process of embedding in war journalism, which is basically you take a reporter, you put them with a military unit, and then you start to think about the reporting that would come out of such a type of dynamic. So if I am with a group of people, I'm probably going to start feeling an affinity for them. So I'm going to be less likely to report critically. But those people are also directly responsible for my physical safety. And so I'm going to be really, really reluctant to say something negative in that respect. Not to mention the fact that with all of this, if we're talking about war reporting, how are journalists effectively advancing in their careers? They have to be on top of information. They need to be the ones providing kind of the most recent take. And if people are reporting critically on the government, officials within government are not going to be giving you that kind of information that's necessary or helpful for career advancement. And so then what you wind up having is what's referred to as this like soda straw effect. Like you're just looking through a soda straw, which is not necessarily a problem if you have a bunch of different straws that you can look through to kind of get a big picture. But what we find out is that that's not what people are getting. And so you're getting this very kind of myopic view. And so there's this intimate relationship again, which is something that we can look at in a contemporary sense, but it's again something that's really not new. And that's a theme that I think comes up repeatedly in this book, is that a lot of the things that we're seeing have their roots that go, in some cases, really, really far back in U.S. history. Yeah,
they've been doing it forever. So in this episode of the cover-up that I just released, it features Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. And and he's a Stanford economist, epidemiologist. And one of the things we talk about is a quasi-academic center at Stanford, and these are all over elite universities now, called the Stanford Internet Observatory, which is in fact financed by government grants, and it gives the imprimatur of a third-party objective censorship machine. They're rooting out misinformation. In this case, COVID dissidents like Jay Bhattacharya. Is there a similar analog in explicit military? Do they actually finance anti-war censorship, or is it this symbiotic ecosystem that you're describing?
Well, we know certainly during Vietnam, for instance, there were direct financing and efforts to root out.
I guess if they told us, they'd have to kill us, right?
Well, that's part. Well, part of the only reason we know, of course, is because of leaked information ex post. So we don't know right now. I don't think there's anything as explicit as what you just said at a university, for instance, that I'm aware of. But no doubt, we know that people are being monitored. People are being tracked and so on. And, a lot of this, I think, if we step back beyond just war in general, COVID, all this stuff, it's people have to think about their framing of the marketplace of ideas. That's what this debate is ultimately about. And do you believe there should be an open marketplace of ideas in which people can say things that you might find unsatisfactory, repugnant, but they can offer those ideas subject to contestability by other people? Now, some people say, no, we can't allow that because then you'll get the crazy saying stuff. Well, then the question always is, who's going to police this? And of course, it's the government. And then you have to ask yourself, well, what do you think they're going to do? What criteria they're going to use, and why are they the objective standards? And by the way, if there's a marketplace of ideas, part of a marketplace is a process through which ideas are filtered out, experimented with, and discovered. And policing ideas assumes that you know what the right ideas are ex ante, assuming you're a benevolent person. You still have to know. And so that's one thing to think about. On the media stuff, it's kind of like on the military stuff, it's almost like a revolving door. We tend to think of the revolving door between the movement, between government and the private sector. Mm-hmm. But people leave military positions, whether civilians or military, in national security positions. And what are they going to do? Some retire and go live their life. Other people, many of them, create consulting firms, or whether they're consulting with the military or they become consultants or experts. And of course, as you full know, for most media, mainstream media certainly, credentials matter. Letters at the end of your name, titles matter a great deal. And so when you put someone on that's former CIA, that sounds nice. It sounds like that person has some kind of unique insight because they're an expert on the world. That's problematic in itself. But also there's certain biases tied up in that. In other words, it's highly unlikely that someone coming from that background is going to question the endeavor itself. What is the United States government doing over there in the first place? So we just come out of Afghanistan, whatever you think of that. one question you might ask is, what is going on? Like, shouldn't we step back for a moment and say, what have we done? And maybe this is a function not of not trying hard enough, not of Biden messing up with the exit, but the U.S. government is really bad at certain things. And it's like, no, people talk about that for a week, maybe, if that. Mm-hmm. And then the next thing happens. Then you get Ukraine. Then 6 months from now, there'll be something else. And it's an inevitable cycle once you have that framework, because there's injustices and wrongs happening all the time around the world. And when your criteria is our job, our being the U.S. government, to correct injustices around the world, well, that's good for business. But it's bad for taking into account constraints, incentives, but also the real harms you can do to people both abroad and domestically, even if you are motivated by the best of intentions.
Well, it doesn't keep us safe because of blowback and unintended consequences. That's right. It seems like every time we make a mistake on foreign policy, we create 5 new problems. And that does make it back to our shores, yep, whether we like it or not.
Right. And it's beyond blowback, too. And we discuss this, particularly in the conclusion. We talk about this idea of tripwires, that when you are intimately involved in so many different places abroad, things which in reality would have absolutely nothing to do with the U.S. government and have absolutely no consequence on the lives of U.S. citizens whatsoever, suddenly become these larger issues in which then the U.S. government becomes entangled. But beyond the points of blowback, and this is something that we mention here, but in other work we talk about more explicitly, is that these interventions in which the U.S. government engages fundamentally erodes the domestic constraints that were very purposefully placed upon government. And so, again, as Chris mentioned, even if the intervention is undertaken with the most benevolent of intentions, that doesn't fundamentally change the consequence of those interventions. It's not a matter of intent. The outcomes wind up looking the same.
At Kibbe on Liberty, freedom is a lifestyle 24/7, something you live and breathe and wear every day. If that describes you, you need the very best Liberty swag in the market today, just like this shirt I happen to be wearing. Go to freethepeople.org/KOL and check out our exciting merch. You too can love liberty and look cool.
Yeah. I want to talk about, and I want to try to be optimistic about this, which I struggle with sometimes these days, because it seems like, if anything, this machine, the elites that drive foreign policy, it seems like they have more control and more power than ever in my lifetime. And maybe I was just more naive now, and I'm more awake. I've been red pilled on the military industrial complex, but thinking about their reaction, the persecution of Edward Snowden and Julian Assange, I feel like it's harder and harder to make an example out of these guys, because there are more and more ways to be whistleblowers and not get caught. Is that true, or are they accomplishing their goal by I think before this is done, barring some miracle pardon from the next president, I think Assange is going to die in prison, and that's exactly what they want to happen. Can we be optimistic that there's more Julian Assanges coming down the pike, or are they winning because they're destroying him?
Well, you can view it either way. And so if there's more or less, I'm not sure. But I would like to think there are more people who are willing to, number one, because of the example that's been set, but then going back to what we were talking about earlier, just the amount of information that is available. So the interesting thing about the state of the world now is, on the one hand, government can try to influence and control information, but it's harder and harder to do, as you were saying earlier, just because ordinary people now can have access to information, can have thoughts that they share with other people, where that was really difficult in the past. And, whistleblowers have always been with us to some extent, but they also have always been a thorn in the side of government. So, of course, well before Snowden, Daniel Ellsberg, of course, perhaps being classic. Ernest Fitzgerald, of course, the cost accountant that people forget about, one of the first whistleblowers. He lost his job under Nixon, I believe, because he wasn't revealing any kind of deep information about foreign operations. He was pointing out that there were massive cost overruns in the Pentagon and that they could be paying less for stuff. So this wasn't some staunch anti-war person. He's like, hey, guys, we're paying 10 times what we should be paying, and no one's doing anything about this. You're fired. And of course, he sued the Nixon administration. It took him, I think, decades to get his job back.
Yeah.
So from that standpoint, I think we can be optimistic. From the standpoint, there's more, I think, opportunity for people to reveal information about wrongdoing. The pessimistic part, perhaps, is exactly what you just said. Despite all that, governments still possess a lot of power, and they can ruin people's lives. And they can, if they don't put you to death directly, they can slowly put you to death, which is what we're observing now. We can send you to various parts of the world and jam you up in the legal system and threaten to extradite you here and there. And it's a never-ending process where you just wither away in various prisons.
Yeah. I mean, we know about these two, and I think they're heroic, patriotic guys. We know about them, but I wonder how many people we don't even know about because they've been dealt with.
Yep.
I was thinking about, but back to, I'm going to try to be optimistic again, back to the church committee, and thinking about, like, in a lot of ways, they were lucky to expose what they did because the agencies, and I believe particularly the CIA, was busy destroying documents before.
Yep, that's right.
Before they could get a hold on them. You can't destroy the internet.
Yep.
You can shred documents, you can burn documents, but you, again, back to these guys from Drastic, they're pulling all of these government documents from, and I don't even understand this technologically, but it's out there. You can get it. Which led to the sort of comical, this goes back to the satire. Some bureaucrat at the FBI was reading some poor guy's tweets, and if he told a bad joke about Biden, they were marking it as unacceptable behavior. That seems like a joke. Like I guess it's fundamentally offensive and un-American and crazy, but it's also like comically ridiculous.
Yeah.
This gets to my pitch to you guys. Have you seen Burn After Reading, famous Coen brothers movie about the intelligence industrial complex?
Yep. Years ago I saw it.
It's an absurd comedy about how ridiculous and stupid they are. Or maybe you've seen Death of Stalin. I feel like this should be a comedy. And you should create characters. You guys can be the characters to go teach these guys how to better
We'll be
run
the
a war.
academics. Yes.
Because I think this actually would make a beautiful comedy piece. What do you think?
I mean, I'm here for it.
Yeah. You and me both.
Yeah, as Chris mentioned, one of the things that I think is really helpful about satire as a medium is exactly what you've pointed out, is that it's funny. And so at least the hope is that at some point while reading this, people will chuckle or laugh or crack a smile, but then in the back of their head say, wait a minute, why am I laughing at this? Because this is actually awful.
Yeah.
But I'd be totally fine with that. I don't know how my acting chops would hold up, but I'd be willing to test it.
We've started producing comedy at Free the People in large part because I was inspired. There's a trend, like some of the most interesting public dissidents, intellectual dissidents, people that are asking the kinds of questions you wish more Americans could ask. They got their start in comedy. And you can start with Joe Rogan, but you certainly don't have to end there. You could look at Jimmy Dore, Dave Chappelle, Russell Brand. The list goes on and on and on. And these guys are able to translate a very dense subject matter into something that is entertaining, but also fundamentally true. So I think I'm not joking about potentially doing something with this, because I think that's the way to get people to pay attention. All due respect, your academic works are not going to
No,
reach
you're certainly right.
Not going to reach everybody.
Right. And that's why we wrote this. Part of the reason we wrote it, and part of the reason we kept it short and accessible. It's very accessible. So we're academic economists by day, but the book, and it is referenced
there's
an
no
academic
shame in
book.
that. There's no shame in that.
I'm very proud of it, and I love it, and I'm grateful for it. But we were thinking to ourselves, how can we present these ideas to people in ways that will be accessible and they might enjoy reading, but also, of course, internalize the lesson. Yeah. And so that's much of the motivation behind the style. So
this is published by our friends at the Independent Institute to lean into the metaphors. I assume the release is just going to blow up, right?
That's the hope. Yeah. That is the hope.
You're going to take over the world.
Peacefully.
Yeah.
Peacefully
blow up. What is the practical strategy? Obviously you're doing shows like this and you're talking to people, but how do you get this out there?
I mean, doing programs like this, word of mouth, social media.
Are you going to get on Rogan?
If they invite, sure.
Joe, if you're listening, straight to camera, have these guys on. But and I told you this story before, and this is a frustration as someone that actually works in the belly of the beast. And I've worked on the Hill, I've worked in public policy,
Yep.
I worked in advocacy, and I used to have to go on TV, and I would need like useful talking points in real time from a more war skeptic position, and I couldn't find it. And we now have the Quincy Institute and a couple other places that are doing this in real time, but this entire town is bought and paid for either directly or indirectly by the military-industrial complex. So you probably shouldn't be here. You should be outside the Beltway, talking to normal people, not weirdos like me. But I love this story, and if you want people to take away one thing from this book, I'm going to ask both of you guys this question. What's the big reveal? Like, what's the thing that people are going to say, like, I never thought about that before?
Start.
Yeah, I would say this. War is not inevitable, and peace is possible. And it's possible on a large global scale. It is a choice, and it is a choice that ordinary people can influence.
And I think to add on to that, another takeaway would be the foreign policy in which the U.S. government has historically engaged and in which it is currently engaged is a remarkably high-cost activity. And I'm not just talking about monetary cost. I am talking about human lives. I am talking about liberty. And that is not only liberty abroad, but that is also liberty at home. And so to be supportive of U.S. foreign policy in the way in which it is currently conducted requires those costs to be paid. And it doesn't matter if you're okay with those costs or not. Those are the cost. And so I would like for people to have a more complete understanding or a fuller accounting of exactly what is required for U.S. foreign policy.
That would have been a good close for the segment, but I just thought of something I wanted to ask you guys. So we're gonna go back and maybe Miguel can rearrange it. But I'm just joking. But what happened to the anti-war left?
It's a good question. I've honestly, and maybe Chris has a better answer to this, I've actually asked myself that question a lot. So I was in junior high on 9/11. And so I'm talking like high school in the first start of the invasion of Iraq. And I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, which is a really blue city. And I remember distinctly during that period there being frequent protest on like one of the main drags in the city. And very much, people on the left who were vehemently pushing back against the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And they really, I don't know where they went. I think some of it may have to do with kind of a shift in the way that some of our foreign policies are carried out. So you start to see a lot more done with UAVs, for instance, under the Obama administration. And so I think some of that is easier to obfuscate, or people just frankly aren't paying attention. But beyond that, I'm not sure that I have a really profound explanation for for where that went. I'd like for them to come back. So if they're hiding somewhere, I'd be happy to see them.
Well, I think it was, again, it's never one cause, but I think it was the election of Barack Obama. I think that was a major shift where people had come out strongly against the Bush administration. Again, certainly even at its peak, it wasn't anything like Vietnam at its peak. So even then, it wasn't as strong as in the past. But Barack Obama largely ran on not being George W. Bush. And of course, Obama won the Nobel Peace Prize, remember, to my way of thinking, for not being George W. Bush. He holds, by the way...
He hadn't even had a chance to drop any bombs yet.
Well, I was going to say, a little known fact, he's the only Nobel Peace Prize winner to bomb another Nobel Peace Prize winner because the U.S. droned Doctors Without Borders by accident, of course, the claim.
Yeah.
So then it goes away, basically, and never came back. And of course, now the interesting shift you see in U.S. politics is many Republicans have become anti-war, supposedly, but I think in a very bastardized way, meaning that it's largely tied up with the MAGA movement of nationalism, of isolationism, as compared to the way certainly I envision anti-war, which is not isolating the United States from the rest of the world, but a much more cosmopolitan, integrated type vision of the world. So you see a kind of a shift back among Republicans now compared to, for instance, like the neocons. But the motivation behind that, I think, is very different than the points I would emphasize. Yeah,
it's a complex stew, and I would even point to that Ron Paul moment when he's debating Rudy Giuliani. And, they thought they'd pack the room with Republican donors who hated what Ron Paul had to say.
Yep.
But of course, the rest of us loved it, and he ignited this revolution. I think, it's sort of ironic that Trump is given credit for arguing against the war in Iraq because, of course, at the time he was all for it. But he saw, I think he's a political arbitrage of kind. Said, well, it worked for Ron Paul, and I see these young upstarts like Rand Paul and Thomas Massie and Justin Amash and Mike Lee actually making some more principled arguments, and so he's smart enough to tap into that vein.
Sure,
I'll take it if he's going to do it, but maybe that's another reason why the left has faded away. Even Bernie Sanders is not the principled non-interventionist voice that maybe he was 10 years ago. Maybe it's just a partisan thing.
Right.
If they're for it, then we're on the other side. Maybe it's that dumb. Maybe there's a satirical book to be written about that.
Might be.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you guys. I assume that this book is available everywhere. The military-industrial complex hasn't kept it off of Amazon or anything horrible like that?
No, it was paperback, Kindle, audiobook. So all forms. And if they get one, there'll be other forms available.
Cool. And are you on social media?
I am on social media.
Okay, tell us where.
So I am on Facebook. I'm also on Twitter at Abigail R. Hall. People Google me, I should pop up. So they can reach me through my website or reach me on socials.
Were you censored as far as you know during?
Not that I'm aware of, but who knows?
They would never tell you. And where do we find you?
Coyne.com is my website with all my work, and then Coyne1 is Twitter.
Okay, everybody go out, buy this book, How to Run Wars, a confidential playbook for the national security elite. It is top secret, so get it while you can.
That's right.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you,
Thanks
Matt.
so much.
We appreciate it.
Thanks for watching. If you liked the conversation, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and also ring the bell for notifications. And if you want to know more about Free the People, go to freethepeople.org.